Coming in at number 10, heroin used to be used as a children's cough syrup. German drug company Bayer made a heck of a lot of money selling heroin to parents. Get a load of these babies! Heroin was a prescription drug in the US until 1914, and then it was banned in 1924. Can you imagine how children would be after a sweet dose of Bayer heroin? Like, Christ. Coming in at number 9, Hugo Boss designed Nazi party uniforms. Hugo Boss is a luxury German fashion house that now sells its product globally and is frequently seen on runways. The designer brand started up in 1924 and originally supplied the Nazi party. This all went down before and during World War II. Comedian Russell Brand was actually even ousted from the GQ Man of the Year awards after making Nazi jibes at the brand in 2013. So, remember Thomas Edison from your history lessons? You know, the light bulb guy. Well, he had a very dark side that your teachers did not tell you about. He actually murdered an elephant, and this is coming in at number 8. Thomas Edison devoted his life to working with electricity. Unfortunately, he got pretty brutal when he needed to prove a point. In 1903, the American inventor murdered an elephant to prove that an alternating current was a bad idea. He even invited 1,500 people to watch as he murdered Topsy the elephant at Luna Park Zoo on Coney Island. He also filmed it and released the footage to the public, and it's actually really heartbreaking to watch. I would say I'd boycott light bulbs, but not really an option. Coming in at number 7, remember that song that you guys used to sing as a kid in the playground, the Ring a Ring o' Roses one? Well, it's actually a death song. Ring a Ring o' Roses is a song about people dying from the plague. Ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. You know how it goes. So Ring o' Roses refers to the rash that plague victims would develop. The pocket full of posies refers to herbs that people would carry around to protect themselves from the plague. The a tissue bit is like people sneezing like a sick person, and we all know what all fall down means. That's people physically dropping down dead and dying from the plague. Fun. Okay, next up. In school I was taught a lot about the Roman Empire, but I was never taught this. At number 6, Romans used to use human urine as mouthwash and crushed mouse brains as toothpaste. Gross. Blah. Get the mouse brains out of my mouth. Get the mouse brains out of my mouth. I guess they had to keep their breaths fresh somehow, but yeah, I don't know, urine wouldn't be my choice. They also used urine to clean their clothes. This is basically because ammonia, which is found in pee, takes out stains, so basically they were more concerned with having white teeth than fresh, non-pee smelling breath. Personally, I'd really pass on cleaning my teeth with pee and brains. It's just a personal choice. Coming in at number 5, Saddam Hussein was actually given the key to the city of Detroit. History paints Saddam Hussein as a bad guy, mainly because he was indeed a bad guy. But nonetheless, after making a donation to a church in Detroit in 1979, basically because a reverend praised him, he was handed the city keys. The American history books aren't so proud of that one. Coming in at number 4, famous explorer Christopher Columbus used to rape children. Yeah, so I guess that kind of extinguishes the yay for Columbus and his explorations party. In some places, people even go as far as to celebrate a Christopher Columbus Day. The problem is, not only was he awful to the indigenous people, he also raped them, including the kids. He would often give his lieutenants sex slaves, and he even wrote in one of his diaries that girls from age 9 to 10 were the most desirable. Gross. Gross. Coming in at number 3, schools don't teach us much about Nazi twin experiments. I don't know how much history has shielded people about the kind of experiments that Nazi warlords did on concentration camp victims. Obviously we know that they were gassed, but school history books do leave out a few choice facts. I know a lot about the Josef Mengele experiments, but that's because I've done extensive research on that area of history. A lot of people do not know about the veteran Nazis' sick experiments on twins and other such horrific medical tests. Mengele would inject chemicals into twins' bodies, especially their eyes, and try and change their colours. Later, when he was done with them, he'd murder them. Another Nazi, Isle Koch, allegedly made lamps from human skin. Coming in at number 2, we often don't know the extent of Japanese cruelty in World War II. Possibly because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were so horrific to humanity and the pain echoed throughout Japan for a great deal of time, the extent of Japanese killing in World War II is somewhat brushed over by history. history. Of course, all countries involved inflicted pain and suffering, but did you know that the Japanese torture methods were considered to be the most severe? Did you know that Japanese killed more Chinese soldiers than the number of the entire Jews killed in the Holocaust? Also, Japan wounded more Americans in Alaska than at Pearl Harbor. There were also swathes of reports of Japanese cannibalism and cruelty. Of course, this far into the future, we have to live and let live, but Nazi Germany gets the lion's share of the blame for atrocities, and Japanese war crimes are largely glossed over. Finally, just when you thought we were sort of semi-living in a time of peace, you may not know that Russia and Japan are technically still at war. Two powerful countries who are still sour post-World War II. Yeesh. Even though the countries haven't been engaging in hot war for over 70 years, they never signed a peace treaty officially indicating peacetime between the two nations. The pair still disagree heavily over the Kuril Islands. I for one really hope that they never engage in war again, because that could be devastating for everyone. But then, I don't mean to freak you out, but like, a lot of your teachers are doing it. There are countless reports of teachers having affairs and getting into relationships. A lot of people meet their significant others at work, and it's no different for teachers. Depending on the size of the school, I would bet at least 2 of the teachers at your school are dating right now. I know in my primary school, the headmaster and one of the teachers were having like a seriously long-term affair. Okay, getting more serious, at number 9, a lot of schools have gang problems. It was reported by the National Center of Addiction and Substance Abuse that 45% of American high schools have gangs or gang members on their campuses. Gangs often bring outside violence inside schools, posing threats to other pupils. A lot of people think that schools need to do more about gang culture, offering help and support to kids that are exposed to organised crime. Unfortunately though, the reality is most schools are trying to disassociate themselves with the image of gangs. Coming into number 8, schools cause mental health problems. Over the past few years, there has been growing media attention surrounding the rise of mental health issues amongst school children. In the UK, it's reported that 46% of girls aged 11 to 21 have needed help with their mental health. Meanwhile, doctors have reported a 68% rise in self-harming amongst younger children. British news publication The Telegraph drew a strong link between the pressure and stress of the education system on the younger generation and this increase in mental health issues. The problem is, not many schools have comprehensive mental health programs in place to deal with the rising issue. Coming into number 7, a lot of schools don't know how to handle social media. These days, more than ever, kids bring factors from their external worlds into the classroom. Almost all teenagers have smartphones and are active on things like Snapchat, Twitter and Instagram. Now this is a world that teachers may be less familiar with than the students, and a lot of schools don't yet have proper measures in place to regulate social media. On top of that, schools have shown time and time again that they do not know how to properly manage cyberbullying. Coming in at number 6, 1 in 10 schools in the UK and the USA are failing. Whether or not this is actually the case, several different reports and studies on both countries suggest that 1 in 10 schools are failing. In the UK, it's thought that around 250,000 pupils are attending a failing school. Worryingly, in the States, according to Psych Central anyway, 30% of students fail to graduate high school. Now that's just not good enough. Coming in at number 5, schools don't always do proper background checks on who they employ. Whilst teachers are subject to extensive background checks, not all people that work on school properties are. The school bus drivers, the janitors, contractors, kitchen staff, in many places these people are not subjected to the same rigorous checks. In the UK, for example, vetting blunders led to the employment of Ian Huntley. Now he was a janitor at a school in Soham where he murdered 2 10-year-old girls. Now this was despite having been reported to police for sexual assault on 6 occasions. Coming in at number 4, schools could be killing creativity. Some people theorise that schools just simply don't nurture creativity. Art subjects are being scrapped in many UK institutions, with many people worried that creative subjects will be gradually phased out altogether one day. Coming in at number 3, you're not always taught what you should be. The national curriculum decides what is taught in schools in the UK, and the United States curriculum is largely governed by individual states. Either way, people don't always agree on what should and what should not be taught. For example, in Canada and the United States, people think that children are not adequately being taught about Native American history. Whether or not you agree with this is kind of irrelevant. I guess the issue is who really gets to decide what children learn and should they have that responsibility. This considered, let's move on to our number 2. That's right, coming into number 2, some people think schools are brainwashing you. Now I'm not sure about this, but the dialogue is definitely out there. The problem is that both sides of the political spectrum are concerned that schools are brainwashing their children. In the UK, 6 academy schools have been flagged as radicalisation risks. The problem is that children are very impressionable and some institutions are concerningly using that to suit their agenda. Finally, at number 1, we have some worrying statistics that schools don't want you to know. There have been 279 school shootings in America since 2013. Now this is an average of around 1 a week, which is terrifying. While we may be led into thinking that the issue is being tackled, it's still obviously a big problem in America. 2/3 of schools in the US do conduct active shooter drills, however that still leaves a third unprepared. Also, many argue conducting drills isn't tackling the real issue, the fact that a pupil at the school may be plotting a mass murdering spree without anyone knowing. Coming in at number 10, teachers have favourites and least favourites. And guys, it does affect the way that you're going to be treated. Obviously, I mean come on, it's pretty clear. Just how kids have favourite teachers and least favourite teachers, and just how in life we have favourite and least favourite people, teachers will pick their favourites. Teachers are more likely to help students who are polite to them. They're more likely to grade up their papers if they're borderline, and of course they're more likely to cut these students some slack. Their least favourites, however, are likely to be students who are rude or arrogant, and guess who are going to be downgraded if they're borderline. Even if teachers are supposed to treat their students equally, their emotions do come into play. Coming in at number 9, teachers talk about you behind your back. Remember those least favourite students? Well, teachers don't usually keep that to themselves. Also, if they find you an interesting character, they'll talk about you too. It's not always bad kids that they talk about. If you rotate classes, you will have a number of teachers and they will enjoy talking about you to one another. They'll probably even share stories about you in the staff room. Coming in at number 8, in schools, teachers have drama just like kids. It isn't just you that hates Mr. Fitz. Mrs. Green does too, and whatever, because teachers have staff room dramas too, especially as some of them are wildly different people who have different ways and beliefs on how to do things. Teachers sometimes can't stand one another, but they have to work together, although on the flip side, some of them are dating and they really don't want you to know about it. Coming in at number 7, teachers look up kids and their parents on social media. Yep. You might Facebook stalk people, maybe even your teachers, but they look you up and your parents up too. Curiosity is natural, and finding out that you are actually skipping school to drink in the park or go to the mall is possible with the power of social media. Also, creeping on your parents may go some way to explaining why you are the way you are. Coming in at number 6, schools judge parents as much as the child. Yep, bad kid, bad parents, or so it often goes. If a child never has any food with them for lunch, it's probably the parents' fault. Often teachers will keep an eye on a child that they suspect has a parental issue, and then they will decide whether or not to call them in. Coming in at number 5, I really hope this isn't too much of a secret, failing a test isn't the end of the world. I hope that schools do reveal this to kids, because sometimes kids crumble under pressure of exams, and they should know that messing up on occasion really just isn't the end of the world. When you're 40 years old, you probably won't hinge the failings or successes of your entire life on one exam, so relax, chill out. You'll probably get a better grade if you're not feeling stressed anyway. Okay, next. Shh, don't tell anyone, but not doing your homework probably won't affect your grade. This is coming in at number 4. In most schools, your day-to-day homework won't contribute to your grade. However, your essays and test results will. The reason that you're assigned homework is to prepare your brain for the tests and essays that will count, so it's always a good idea to do it. Although you should know a teacher can't fail you for not doing your homework. Ooh, sorry to tell you, but coming in at number 3, your hard work isn't always read properly when it's graded. Teachers are busy. Imagine, they take 5 different classes a day and they need to grade work from each student in an evening. It's an endless pile. More often than not, teachers will want to get the additional workload done and dusted so they can focus on having a life, because they have one too. The problem is, it does seem a little bit unfair when you spend hours on a piece of work that gets like 3 minutes of attention from teachers just because they want to watch some Netflix. Sad but true, at number 2, a lot of teachers are very unhappy. Teachers kind of have a rough time of it. They're not just working while you're at school, they're there before and after, setting up and tearing down your lessons. Also, then they're marking or preparing for the next day. Most teachers that I know work from 8 AM till 5 or 6 PM, and then they have marking on top of that. They don't get paid that much either, which is a constant bone of contention. Increasingly these days, they also have to deal with violent children, which is very scary, and I guess at the end of the day, sometimes they wonder, is it worth it? Finally, number 1 of our top 10 secrets that schools don't want you to know: big end of year exams are actually proven to be bad for students. There have been a lot of studies that have revealed that end of year exams with big weightings on a student's grade are actually very harmful to them. It turns out that tests aren't always the best way to decipher a person's intelligence, and the system is heavily weighted against those who struggle with anxiety. Hopefully one day there will be a better way to test people in the future. In Finland, for example, there are no tests except for one exam at the end of senior year at high school. Coming in at number 10, a lot of schools give kids poisonous water. A lot of school buildings are old, we know that. Up until the 90s, we really didn't know how damaging lead as a building material was, and a lot of schools have lead pipes or lead paint, which is not okay. Drinking lead water is poisonous. Now, where I live in Ontario, for example, it is supposed to be one of the best areas for education in North America, yet 640 schools and daycare centers failed their lead tests. This means that the drinking water is not safe for kids. Now, in the USA, 350 schools failed the lead test, but that is only roughly 10% of the schools actually regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, so hundreds if not thousands of more are probably pumping out unsafe drinking water to kids. Taking it in another direction, old school buildings may come with more than just lead in the water. At number 9, some schools are haunted. I mean, this totally depends on whether or not you believe in a good old ghoul, but with old schools comes a lot of history. Most schools will have seen a tragedy over their years, but they likely won't advertise it for fear of scaring or distracting the children. There are so many school ghost stories to talk about, but check out this footage from one of the oldest schools in Cork Island. Pretty scary, right? Does your school have a ghost? Let me know. Coming in at number 8, meals are worse than prison food. In the UK and the USA, school cafeteria food just isn't the one. Many of us will remember Jamie Oliver's famous crackdown on terrible school food in Britain in 2005. Back then it was revealed that a meagre 37 pence, so under $1, was the daily budget per child in the UK. This year in the UK, the government plans to push through changes to free school meals without a vote in Parliament. This could see 1 million children go hungry. In the USA, school food is also an issue, with a number of sources concluding that prison food is actually more nutritious. It seems that only 1/3 of US schools are meeting the recommended standard for saturated fat in their meals. With that in mind, consider this sad fact. Coming in at number 7, some kids are too hungry at school to learn properly. Teachers are well accustomed to spotting the lower income kids. Some American children, 13 million according to the Denver Post, go to school hungry. Kids from lower income families often rely on the food that they're fed at school being their only meal that day. If the standard of meal that they're getting is actually not great, then they're obviously not going to get enough nutrients that they need at a crucial time in their lives. Hunger affects a child's ability to concentrate and can dramatically affect their grades. Coming in at number 6, the American school system is one of the worst in the developed world. The PISA school ranking systems ranks the education of 76 countries, and this includes affluent first world nations, but also includes developing nations in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The United States is 27th on the list of 76, but if we were to only include the first world countries, then they'd be right at the bottom of the list. Right now, the education system in Vietnam significantly outranks the USA. Coming into number 5, teachers have secret lives. Shocker, teachers have lives outside of schools, but some have more interesting lives than others. In 2016, the story of teacher Gemma Laird came to light. She was let go from her position at Bloemfontein Primary School in Durham, England. This was because parents of children at the school discovered that she also worked as a model. Her modelling pictures did include some lingerie shots for a catalogue, and parents weren't happy about it. Although the school were aware, they let her go when it was made public. A similar thing happened in Utah to a teacher, Mindy Jensen. Now, she was nearly fired when parents discovered her bodybuilding Instagram account. I don't know though, teachers can have hobbies too. Coming into number 4, teachers are spying on you. It seems that some classrooms have CCTV. A survey done by the National Association of Schoolmasters Union of Women Teachers in the UK found that 1 in 10 classrooms have CCTV. The General Secretary from the union said that lab rats have more privacy. It isn't just the students that are being watched, it's the staff too. They're constantly under pressure to perform. More and more classrooms in the USA are installing CCTV in order to spot illicit behaviour in the classroom. Also, forget CCTV for a moment. Some teachers resort to good old-fashioned peekaboos. Check out this tweet by Joseph Morales. He said the teacher left the room during a test, so he started sharing the answers. He looked up and she was staring right at him through a panel in the ceiling. Coming into number 3, teachers can hit children in both Canada and the USA. According to a 2016 Huffington Post article, both Canada and the United States are not among the 50 countries that have banned physical punishment of children in all settings. Section 43 of the Criminal Code in Canada says that parents or teachers can use force to correct children as long as the force does not exceed what is reasonable under the circumstances. In the States, corporal punishment in schools is legal in 19 states, but it's mainly a problem in the South, especially in Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Tennessee, and Oklahoma. Personally, I really don't think it's okay for teachers to hit children. Coming into number 2, bad grades can lead to suicides. Suicide is a bigger killer in the United States than murder. Most young people who commit suicide are boys, and the numbers begin to spike between the ages of 12 to 15. A study on suicidal behaviour posted on Statista showed that the percentage of people seriously contemplating suicide sharply rises as kids' grades fall. 21% of those receiving D and F grades attempted suicide, and this is compared with just 5.6% of people gaining A grades. A shocking 36% of those with mainly D to F grades admitted to suicidal thoughts. Are schools doing enough to tackle this issue? Many people say no. Finally, coming into number 1, some schools in the UK are reportedly terrorist training grounds. If the right-wing UK tabloids are anything to go by, the UK is speckled with terrorist training grounds masquerading as schools. In 2007, Jamia Islama Islamic School in Kent was closed down after being exposed by anti-terror cops. The hate preacher Abu Hamza was said to have held terror training camps in the school grounds in the 1990s. Obviously, the media went wild with this school, but it did raise a lot of issues and concerns about academy schools in the UK and what exactly children are being taught.
Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easy easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand. Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up. Mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, mumia is creepily just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled. Starting us off at number 10, we have mummy unwrapping parties. So we already know that people love to do do all kinds of weird and strange things with mummies back in the day. But after people widely stopped eating them or using their remains to make medicines, a new mummy trend began. After Napoleon's first expedition to Egypt in 1798, Europeans began to become even more enthralled with mummies than they ever had been. In the 19th century, a mummy craze began. Travelers began bringing back whole mummies they had bought off the street in Egypt, and the next thing you know, they were no longer thought of having medicinal purposes, but rather being a wonderful party activity. Soon it became customary to hold mummy unwrapping parties, and wealthy Victorians would gather around as the host slowly unwrapped the dead body, showing off his wealth while simultaneously giving guests a thrilling evening filled with horror and delight. I have no clue what was done with the mummies after the public unboxing, but somehow I almost think it's better, as I'm sure whatever happened next was even more disgusting. Number 9. Bomb shadows. We all likely know and were taught about the devastating bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed 226,000 people in 1945. But one thing that you may not have learned about was what those bombs left behind. Apparently, as the attack was happening, the light and heat from the weapon was absorbed by the people and the objects in front of it. The surrounding light and heat then ended up bleaching the areas of the ground where nothing had been, leaving objects and people-shaped marks on the pavement. They became known as the shadows of the dead, and even now, after nearly 80 years, some of the shadows remain stained into the pavement and walls all over the city, as a reminder to the human capacity for destruction. Coming in at number 8, Vlad the Impaler. Born into a royal family in 1431, Vlad III was son of Vlad Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia at the time. During this time, Transylvania faced a lot of battles and bloodshed as the Ottoman Empire kept trying to push west towards Europe, and the Christian Crusaders marched eastward towards the Holy Land. In 1442, Vlad Dracul was called to a diplomatic meeting with the Ottomans and brought with him his sons. But the meeting was a trap, and all three were arrested and held hostage. The father was granted to leave as long as he left his sons behind, and he agreed. So for the next few years, Vlad and his brother were trapped and tortured, although they did also strangely tutor the men in science, philosophy, and art, as well as turn them into warriors. Eventually his brother and father both died, and Vlad was released. Soon after, he became the leader of Wallachia, and when the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, Vlad led the force to defend his land from an invasion. It was during this time he became known as Vlad the Impaler, as he often used metal or wooden poles to impale invaders right through their chest, or sometimes he would even insert it vertically up the victim until it pierced through their shoulders, neck, or mouth. While well respected, he became notorious for killing thousands of people, and eventually became the inspiration for Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Count Dracula. Coming in at number 7, incubators. Nowadays, incubators are seen as life-saving devices for premature newborns, but shockingly, this was not always the attitude towards them. During the early 20th century, most physicians kind of held the belief that premature infants were not meant to survive, and so they were tragically just kind of left to die in most cases. But Martin Cooney held a different belief from his peers and wanted to try and change the narrative. But in order to do so, he had to make it a spectacle. One thing that people loved to do back in the day was gawk at the unusual, laugh at the different, and it's for that very reason that sideshows existed. So in order to save the lives of the preemies, Cooney decided to display them in what he called hatcheries as a sideshow in Coney Island. For a quarter, visitors could gaze upon the peculiar and small young people, and over the years he managed to save more than 6,500 lives by packaging up their safety in a swallowable pill for the times he lived in. After so much success, doctors started coming around his ideas, and now they are used by hospitals around the world. Next up at number 6, Pharaoh Pepi. Although the exact timeline is up for debate, somewhere around 2278 BC to 2216 BC, Pharaoh Pepi II reigned in Egypt. The ruler succeeded the throne at age 6 and became widely known as being one of Egypt's most demanding kings, which comes with little to no surprise that a literal first grader being given the power of a pharaoh affected his ego in a negative way. Often he demanded outlandish tasks of his slaves and subjects, but most strange of all was his practice to keep flies off of him. Apparently he hated flies more than anything in the world, so Pepi would force several slaves a day to be covered head to toe in honey and then stand naked by him in hopes to attract the bugs towards them and off himself. By the end of their days, his slaves would be covered in bites, boils, and sores caused by the countless insects that swarmed to them, and soon they would often succumb to diseases like malaria. Later on, flies actually became more or less a creature of high esteem for the Egyptians, becoming a symbol for persistence and tenacity, but for the near 90-year or so reign under Pepi, they were apparently the worst creature alive. Coming in at number 5, a cat phone. In 1929, a pair of scientists at Princeton University had a question. They wanted to test out how the auditory nerve perceives sound. But in order to test that, they had to find a subject. Now, as you can imagine, not too many people were lining up for this, so they ultimately decided to perform the experiment on a cat. The cat was heavily sedated prior to the operation, where the scientists cut out parts of its brain before attaching one end of a telephone wire into its auditory nerve and the other end into a receiver. Shockingly, the cat survived the operation and the scientists went forward with their experiment. To their delight, they discovered that if you spoke into the cat's ear, you could hear it perfectly through the receiver. But their initial success was not enough for them. Next, they had to know if it worked once the cat was dead. So they killed the cat to test their theory, but sadly the cat phone no longer functioned without access to a functional brain. Despite its rather gruesome story, the two did actually contribute to a valuable understanding of the brain and helped future researchers in development of cochlear implants. So at least it wasn't all in vain. Coming in at number 4, death photography. Memento mori means remember you must die. For centuries, trinkets were used to keep the thought of death close and to help the living through their grieving process. In Victorian times, this looked like lockets filled with hair of the dead, a mask of your loved one created out of wax, or by having paintings and sculptures made in their memory. But all of a sudden, a new invention came along that led to creating an all-new kind of memento mori, the photograph. As its popularity increased, the price of having your photo taken was all of a sudden cheaper than a portrait, and many began using this new technology to keep the essence of their loved ones preserved forever. Next thing you know, families are getting photos taken with their dead family members, and for many, it was even the first time getting a photo taken. The dead were sometimes propped up to look alive, while other times eyeballs were painted on after it developed to give them a more lifelike look. The pictures would be hung in the house just like any normal family portrait and served as a reminder to the family of the ones they lost. Thankfully, the practice went out of style as healthcare began to improve and less people were dying so young. Coming in at number 3, gibbeting. During medieval times, the practice of execution was really just an average Tuesday afternoon, and even darker was that it was pretty common practice for criminals to be left on the gallows after they were hanged, as sort of a warning sign to the others in the town. But another form of torturous death they made criminals endure was called gibbeting. The ancient practice consisted of humiliating and hanging a criminal from a large post, but unlike being hanged, the convict was stuffed inside a small cage that was left dangling in the air. The victim would be put in the cage completely alive and essentially left to rot, while people of the town gathered round to witness the spectacle, often even torturing the criminal in their own ways. Eventually, after starvation, cold, and muscle atrophy, they would die and their rotting bodies would be left inside the hanging cage for weeks, sometimes even years, until nothing but their skeletons remained inside. Eventually, the practice was outlawed by the mid-1800s, but some say that if you walk past an old gibbeting cage, you can still hear the screams of the soul who died inside. Coming in at number 2, chats with a severed head. In the early 1900s, a French physician named Gabriel Boudieu was interested in exploring the connection between mind, brain, and body. So in 1905, when the execution of Henri Languille was announced, he rushed to the guillotine to study the aftermath. Boudieu claimed that after the guillotine dropped and the head fell to the ground, he called out to the victim and the severed head allegedly blinked his eyes as if awakening. He wrote, "The eyelids lifted up, this time I swear, in a distinctly normal movement, slow as if awakening or torn from thought." He further detailed that the pupils focused in on him until slowly the eyelids faded closed. But once again, he called the man's name and his eyes opened. Some believe that it was simply leftover nerve impulses, but Gabriel swore that the head could hear him and understand him. He said he felt something looking into his eyes and knew it wasn't just a coincidence. And last up today, the Leningrad famine. For 872 days, the people of Leningrad suffered one of the most destructive military blockades in history. In just a little less than 3 years, the population dropped from 2.5 million to just 800,000. In September of 1941, they were bombarded by the Axis powers and cut off from the outside world, receiving no wood, no gas, no coal, and no food. And it only got worse once winter hit. Soon they were trying to stay alive with no food in -40-degree temperatures, and so many resorted to burning their possessions just to evade death one more day. But as time went on, it only got darker and darker. People would leave their homes and never return. At first, many assumed they died in the cold, but suddenly it was happening more and more frequently. It didn't take too long to draw a connection to the mysterious disappearances, as the next day there would magically be meat available at the market, usually labeled as horse or dog. Soon after, people began killing firsthand, just to feed themselves, and some were even driven to kill their own families just to survive. Officially, there are 2,000 recorded cases of eating human flesh, but it's believed to be much higher. All the while, of course, the elite hoarded food that came into the city via the lakes and never once went hungry. There are journal recordings from the same time about eating goose and caviar at a party while the commoners froze to death in the streets.